Hey guys, tonight we're going to take a journey back in time. Not to a golden age of philosophy and democracy, but to a world where a cough could be a curse and a fever a sign of divine wrath. We're stepping into ancient Greece, a land of stunning architecture and profound thought, but also a place where pestilence's shadow looms over every single person. Imagine the searing heat of the Athenian summer, the crowded streets, the mingled scents of olive oil, sweat, and something else. Something a little off, a little sickly. You probably won't survive this journey unscathed, because in ancient Greece, disease wasn't just a physical affliction. It was a constant, terrifying force, woven into the very fabric of life and death. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, let me know where you're listening from and what time it is for you right now. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. You find yourself in an ancient Greek city, perhaps Athens or Corinth, bustling with life, but beneath the vibrant surface, there's an undercurrent of vulnerability. Life expectancy is shockingly low by modern standards if you make it past childhood. You're already defying the odds. The air itself feels heavy with potential threats, unseen. Microscopic enemies lurking in every breath, every bite, every drop of water. You might wake with a tickle in your throat, and immediately, a cold dread settles in your stomach. Is it just a common cold, or something far more sinister? The kind of sickness that lays you low for weeks, or worse. For the ancient Greeks, the concept of illness was deeply intertwined with their polytheistic beliefs. Disease wasn't just a biological phenomenon. It was often seen as a direct intervention by the gods. If you suddenly fell ill with a mysterious wasting sickness, perhaps you had offended Apollo, the god of healing but also of plague. If a sudden paralysis struck, maybe it was a curse from a vengeful spirit, or a sign that you had angered a local deity. This belief system meant that your first recourse for illness often wasn't a physician, but a priest, or a trip to a sacred healing site. Historians still argue whether this divine interpretation hindered or, paradoxically, helped early medical practices by encouraging observation of symptoms. Consider the common ailments that would plague your daily life. You might suffer from persistent fevers, the kind that leave you weak and drenched in sweat, a symptom of countless undiagnosed infections. Diarrhea and dysentery would be rampant, especially in crowded urban centers with poor sanitation. A scratch or a cut, easily dismissed today, could quickly become infected, leading to gangrene and limb loss, or a slow, agonizing death from sepsis. You'd see people limping from untreated fractures, their bones healed crookedly, a permanent reminder of an accident, or perhaps a neighbor with a persistent, hacking cough, growing thinner by the day, the telltale signs of tuberculosis, a disease that silently claimed countless lives across the ancient world. You might joke, grimly, that the best health insurance in ancient Greece was probably just avoiding everyone and living in a cave. The diet, while often wholesome, lacked the variety and refrigeration we take for granted. Food spoilage was common, contributing to digestive issues. Water sources, particularly in cities, were often contaminated, a breeding ground for parasites and bacteria. Imagine dipping your cup into a public fountain, knowing, but not truly understanding, the unseen dangers lurking within. A quirky tidbit is that the Greeks believed certain diseases, especially epilepsy, were considered sacred diseases, directly connected to divine influence, rather than purely physical ailments, which complicated their medical understanding. In this world, where life was fragile and death a constant companion, disease was a daily conversation, a shared fear. You lived with the knowledge that, at any moment, the gods might send a plague, or a minor ailment could spiral into something fatal. Your resilience wasn't just physical, it was deeply psychological, a constant negotiation with the unseen forces of illness and fate. and as you drift off to sleep. You can almost hear the faint coughing from a distant house, a chilling reminder of the ever-present threat, as you navigate the bustling, yet often unhygienic, streets of ancient Greece. You're acutely aware of the pervasive belief system that governs explanations for illness. It's not about invisible germs or cellular malfunctions. It's about the whims of powerful entities. You are constantly reminded that the gods, curses, and cures are intricately linked, shaping how everyone, including yourself, perceives and responds to sickness. If a sudden fever grips you, turning your skin flushed and your body weak, your first thought might well be, which god have I angered? Apollo, the shining god of the sun, was also the bringer of plagues, capable of raining down sickness with his arrows. Just as he could inspire prophecy and music, conversely, he was also associated with healing, making him a complex figure in matters of health. If your crops failed or your family fell ill, you might immediately suspect divine displeasure. Perhaps you forgot a sacrifice, spoke ill of a hero, or broke an oath. This deep-seated belief meant that a significant portion of early medical intervention involved propitiation, appeasing the angry deity through prayers, offerings, and rituals. Take, for instance, the story of Oedipus and the plague of Thebes. A mainstream historical fact is that in Sophocles' play, Oedipus Rex, the city is devastated by a plague, explicitly described as a punishment from the gods for an unpunished crime. This literary reflection highlights how deeply ingrained this divine causality was in the Greek psyche. If a citywide epidemic struck, public sacrifices would be offered, processions would wind through the streets, and oracles would be consulted to discern the gods' will and the nature of their anger. You might join such a procession, carrying an offering, desperate to appease whatever unseen force was inflicting such suffering. Beyond direct divine wrath, illness could also be attributed to curses laid by envious neighbors, wronged individuals, or powerful sorcerers. If you suddenly developed a persistent cough that wouldn't go away, or a mysterious swelling, you might whisper to your neighbor, wondering who might bear you ill will. A common practice was to leave curse tablets, small lead tablets inscribed with curses, at temples or graves, invoking deities or spirits to inflict harm, including illness, on an enemy. A quirky tidbit, some curse tablets specifically asked for targeted ailments, like blindness, lameness, or specific organ pains, showing a detailed, if malevolent, understanding of human vulnerabilities. The inverse of divine punishment was, of course, divine favor. If you recovered from a grave illness, it wasn't necessarily due to the skill of a physician, but seen as a direct blessing from a healing deity. Asclepius, the god of medicine, was the most prominent of these healing deities. People would make pilgrimages to his temples, hoping for a dream visit from the god that would reveal a cure, or for a miraculous recovery. You'd hear stories of the lame walking and the blind seeing, all attributed to Asclepius's divine touch. This belief in miraculous cures, while perhaps not scientifically sound, offered hope in a world where medical understanding was still in its infancy. Historians still argue whether the dominance of religious explanations for disease hindered the development of empirical medical science, or if it laid some groundwork by encouraging observation of the sick, albeit with a religious filter. While sacrifices and prayers might seem unscientific to us, they represented a structured response to illness, a way for communities to cope with the seemingly random blows of disease. You might witness a child suffering from a high fever, and see their desperate parents first pray to Zeus, then make offerings to Asclepius, before finally, perhaps as a last resort, seeking the advice of a local herbalist. This intertwining of religion and illness meant that the sick weren't just physically unwell, they were often seen as spiritually or morally compromised. The social stigma of certain ailments, particularly those that were disfiguring or long-lasting, could be immense. You wouldn't just be fighting the disease itself, but also the societal judgment that came with it. It's a constant reminder that in ancient Greece, your health wasn't just a personal matter, It was a reflection of your standing with the gods, and sometimes with your community. Given the pervasive belief in divine intervention and curses, it's no surprise that when illness struck, one of your primary hopes for recovery might not lie in a dusty physician's office, but in a sacred space, the Temple of Asclepius. These healing sanctuaries, dedicated to the god of medicine, were far more than just places of worship. They were complex centers combining religious ritual, psychological comfort, and often practical health advice. Imagine yourself arriving at Epidaurus, one of the most famous Asclepiae, nestled in a serene valley. You're probably weak from a persistent fever or a chronic ailment, perhaps a painful joint or a recurring cough that won't leave you. The air is calm, fragrant with pine trees, and there's a palpable sense of peace, a deliberate contrast to the chaos of the city or the pain of your sickness. You wouldn't just walk in and demand a cure. There was a process, a series of rituals designed to prepare you, both physically and spiritually, for divine healing. First, you'd undergo purification. This might involve ritual bathing in sacred springs, cleansing your body of impurities, both physical and spiritual. You might offer sacrifices to Asclepius, perhaps a small coin, a simple cake, or, if you were wealthy, an animal. The idea was to show your devotion, to make yourself worthy of the god's attention. This isn't just about faith, it's about a holistic approach, a way to calm your mind and prepare your body. A quirky tidbit is that you might also be required to abstain from certain foods or wine, or even from sexual activity, further emphasizing the purification aspect. The core of the healing process at an Asclepieion was incubation, or enkoimesis. After purification and offerings, you would be led to a special dormitory, often called the abaton, where you would sleep. The hope was that Asclepius himself, often accompanied by his sacred snake symbols of healing and regeneration, would appear to you in a dream. In this dream, the god might directly heal you, or he might reveal the specific cure or treatment you needed. Imagine lying there, in the dim light of the dormitory, surrounded by other hopeful supplicants, straining to hear every rustle, every murmur, desperate for a divine visitation. Historians still argue whether the apparent cures at these temples were due to genuine divine intervention, the placebo effect, or simply the natural course of illness alongside the basic hygiene and rest provided. While divine intervention was the goal, the temples weren't entirely devoid of practical care. Priests, often called therapeuti, served as intermediaries between the supplicants and the god. They would interpret dreams, offer advice, and sometimes even suggest practical remedies based on their observations. These might include dietary changes, exercise, herbal concoctions, or even minor surgical procedures performed by temple attendants. Though not in the same vein as a trained physician, you'd see votive offerings adorning the temple walls, small clay or stone replicas of healed body parts, like a leg, an arm, or an eye, left by grateful patients as a testament to their miraculous cures. These offerings served as powerful visual affirmations, bolstering the faith of new arrivals. The environment itself played a crucial role. Asclepiae were typically located in beautiful, tranquil settings, often with access to fresh air, clean water, and therapeutic baths. The emphasis on rest, a good diet compared to a typical poor diet, and a calm, hopeful atmosphere undoubtedly contributed to recoveries, regardless of divine intervention. You might joke that it was the ancient Greek equivalent of a health spa, only with more snakes and prayers. The psychological aspect of hope and belief, combined with rudimentary care, must have provided genuine comfort to many suffering individuals. Ultimately, visiting a temple of Asclepius was an act of profound faith, a last resort for many, and a testament to the limited understanding of disease in ancient Greece, while modern medicine relies on empirical evidence. For the Greeks, a dream from Asclepius, a snake slithering across your sleeping body, or a feeling of renewed vitality after a ritual bath, were concrete signs of a benevolent God reaching down to alleviate human suffering. And as you imagine yourself closing your eyes in the abaton, hoping for that divine dream, You feel the weight of centuries of human suffering and the desperate, universal longing for healing, while the divine interventions at the temples of Asclepius offered hope and comfort. A radical shift in understanding disease was slowly taking root, spearheaded by figures who dared to look beyond the wrath of the gods. This brings us to the monumental influence of humoral theory's reign, a concept that would dominate Western medical thought for over 2 millennia. Your understanding of illness is about to become, well, a little more scientific, even if still fundamentally flawed by modern standards. Imagine a physician, not a priest, examining you. He doesn't ask which god you've angered, but instead meticulously observes your symptoms, the color of your skin, the nature of your cough, the quality of your pulse, the contents of your bodily excretions. This is the world shaped by Hippocrates of Cos, often hailed as the father of medicine. A mainstream historical fact is that Hippocrates and his followers, known as the Hippocratic school, moved away from supernatural explanations for disease and focused on rational observation and clinical experience. They believed that illness had natural causes, and therefore, natural remedies. It was a revolutionary idea, laying the groundwork for what we now recognize as scientific medicine. The cornerstone of Hippocratic thought was the humoral theory. This theory posited that the human body contained 4 fundamental fluids, or humors: blood associated with the heart, air, and the sanguine temperament optimistic, courageous, phlegm associated with the brain, water, and the phlegmatic temperament calm, unexcitable, yellow bile choler, associated with the liver, fire, and the choleric temperament irritable, ambitious, black bile melancholy associated with the spleen, earth, and the melancholic temperament, analytical, prone to sadness. According to this theory, you were healthy when these 4 humors were in perfect balance, or eucrasia, illness, or dyscrasia, occurred when there was an imbalance, too much of one humor, or too little. If you had a fever, it might be due to an excess of yellow bile. If you were lethargic and pale, perhaps too much phlegm. Your cough might be caused by an accumulation of cold, moist phlegm in the lungs. It was a neat, comprehensive system that explained every ailment, even if it turned out to be completely wrong. You might joke that it was the ancient Greek version of a check engine light, only instead of oil and coolant, you had bile and phlegm. The role of the physician, therefore, was to restore this balance. This could involve a range of treatments. Bleeding. If you had too much blood, a fever, a physician might cut a vein to drain some out. It sounds terrifying, doesn't it? And often, it was. Purging vomiting or diarrhea might be induced with emetics or laxatives to expel excess humors. Diet and lifestyle changes. If you were too melancholic, perhaps a change in diet to warm, dry foods would be prescribed. Herbal remedies, specific herbs were believed to affect certain humors. A quirky tidbit is that the seasons were also thought to influence the humors. Spring was associated with blood, summer with yellow bile, autumn with black bile, and winter with phlegm, meaning your susceptibility to certain illnesses could change with the time of year. This added another layer of complexity to diagnosis and treatment. Historians still argue whether Hippocratic medicine was truly effective, given its reliance on an incorrect anatomical and physiological model. However, its emphasis on careful observation, prognosis predicting the course of a disease, and the concept of the body's own healing power, vis medicatrix naturae, were incredibly important advancements. Physicians trained in this school would develop a detailed patient history, examining not just symptoms, but also environmental factors, diet, and habits. They recognized the importance of climate and geography in disease patterns, a remarkably astute observation for the time. While we now know the humoral theory was incorrect, its long reign meant that for centuries, you would live in a world where your health was understood through the lens of these 4 fluids. Every diagnosis, every treatment, every discussion about illness revolved around blood, phlegm, and the 2 biles. It was a paradigm shift from divine wrath to natural causes, even if the natural causes themselves were speculative. And as you imagine a thoughtful Greek physician feeling your pulse, pondering the balance of your humors, You sense the quiet revolution taking place, a first tentative step towards a more rational understanding of the mysteries of the human body. With the framework of humoral theory now influencing your understanding of illness, you begin to appreciate the ancient Greek physicians' focus not just on treating disease, but on preventing it. This leads to a strong emphasis on diet and exercise prescriptions, often viewed as the cornerstones of maintaining health and balancing those all-important humors. It's a surprisingly modern approach, even if their underlying biological understanding was, well, ancient. Imagine a Hippocratic physician, perhaps on a house call to your Athenian home, not just observing your symptoms, but asking detailed questions about your daily routine. What do you eat? How much do you move? Do you sleep well? These were crucial diagnostic tools, as lifestyle was directly linked to the balance of humors. You might joke that they were the original wellness gurus, only without the expensive juicers. Diet was considered paramount. Food wasn't just sustenance, it was medicine. Different foods were believed to have specific qualities, hot or cold, wet or dry, that could affect the humors. If you were suffering from an excess of cold, wet phlegm, perhaps causing a persistent cough, the physician might prescribe a diet rich in hot, dry foods like garlic, onions, or strong wines. Conversely, if you had a fever, indicative of too much hot, dry, yellow bile, you might be advised to consume cooling and moistening foods like barley gruel, lettuce, or cucumber. The goal was always to counteract the imbalance. There was a general emphasis on moderation and balance in eating. Overeating was seen as a cause of illness, as it could lead to an excess of humors. Undereating was also problematic. Meats were often consumed in smaller quantities than grains, vegetables, and fruits. Wine, diluted with water, was a staple, but excessive drinking was seen as detrimental to health. A mainstream historical fact is that the Hippocratic corpus, a collection of ancient Greek medical texts, contains extensive discussions on the properties of various foods and their therapeutic uses, demonstrating the deep consideration given to diet. Beyond what you ate, when and how you ate also mattered. Physicians might advise you to eat lighter meals in summer and heavier ones in winter, adapting to the perceived humoral influence of the seasons. Eating quickly or while stressed was also frowned upon. Imagine sitting down to a meal, not just thinking about taste, but about how each bite is affecting your internal balance, a sort of mindful eating from millennia ago. Then there's exercise. The Greeks, famously lovers of the human form and athletic pursuits, deeply understood the connection between physical activity and health. Exercise was seen as essential for moving the humors, expelling waste, and strengthening the body. It wasn't just for athletes. Everyone, from the philosopher to the artisan, was encouraged to engage in some form of physical activity. Your daily routine might involve a morning walk, perhaps a wrestling match at the local palestra, a wrestling school, or even specific exercises prescribed by a physician. The intensity and type of exercise would also be tailored to your constitution and humoral balance. If you were deemed too phlegmatic and sluggish, vigorous exercise like running or wrestling might be prescribed to heat you up and expel excess phlegm. If you were choleric and prone to irritability, perhaps something calmer, like leisurely walking or gentle stretching, would be advised to cool and calm you. A quirky tidbit: ancient Greek physicians sometimes prescribed specific forms of massage, believing it could help move humors and alleviate blockages. Essentially an early form of physical therapy. Historians still argue about the practical effectiveness of these elaborate dietary and exercise regimens in truly curing serious diseases, particularly infectious ones. However, their emphasis on preventative health, moderation, and the interconnectedness of mind and body was remarkably progressive. While they didn't understand germs, they understood that cleanliness, fresh air, and proper digestion contributed to overall well-being. So, as you go about your day in ancient Greece, you're not just thinking about surviving a plague. You're actively engaging in a continuous effort to maintain your internal balance. Every meal, every stroll, Every visit to the gymnasium isn't just a part of your daily life. It's a conscious act of medicine, a proactive measure to keep those humors in check and, hopefully, keep illness at bay. It's a reminder that even in a world riddled with horrifying diseases, the Greeks were already searching for ways to empower themselves against the invisible threats to their health, despite the best efforts of diet, exercise, and propitiating the gods. Disease would inevitably strike, and sometimes a more direct, invasive intervention was deemed necessary. This brings us to the often harrowing world of ancient Greek surgery. Brace yourself, because this is where the limitations of ancient knowledge collide with the desperate need for relief, resulting in procedures that were, by modern standards, rudimentary, often brutal, and incredibly dangerous. Imagine suffering from a deeply infected wound, perhaps from a fall or a clumsy accident with a tool. The pain is throbbing, the flesh around it swollen and discolored, and a foul smell has begun to emanate from it. A Hippocratic physician might examine it, his brow furrowed, and determine that the bad humors or pus needed to be released. This would necessitate an incision. Your heart would pound as you saw the glint of his bronze or iron instruments, scalpels, probes, and forceps, often designed with remarkable precision for their time, but still utterly terrifying. A mainstream historical fact is that ancient Greek surgeons were capable of a surprising range of procedures, including setting broken bones, trepanation drilling holes in the skull to relieve pressure, and even some forms of cataract removal. However, all of these were performed without anesthetics beyond perhaps a bit of opium or mandrake to dull the pain, and certainly without any understanding of sterilization. The concept of invisible germs was millennia away. Imagine the screaming agony as a surgeon cuts into your flesh, the pain searing, your body writhing. You'd be held down by strong assistants, their hands clamped firmly on your limbs, your teeth perhaps gritting on a leather strap. You might joke, if you could breathe, that this was the original no pain, no gain philosophy, only with far higher stakes. For superficial wounds, the physician would clean the area, perhaps with wine or vinegar which had some antiseptic properties, though unknowingly, and then apply bandages soaked in herbal concoctions. But for deeper issues, like abscesses or gangrene, the knife was often the only option. If an infected limb was beyond saving, amputation, while rare due to the sheer risk, was a last resort. The procedure would be swift. The limb sawed off, and then the stump cauterized with a hot iron to prevent bleeding. The smell of burning flesh would fill the air, a sickening aroma mixed with the scent of fear and blood. The shock, the blood loss, and the inevitable infection meant that survival rates for such drastic procedures were incredibly low. Broken bones were another common ailment. Greek physicians were skilled at setting fractures, using splints made of wood or bark, and carefully bandaging the limb to keep it immobilized. They understood the importance of reduction, realigning the bones, and would sometimes apply traction to pull the bones back into place. While they didn't have X-rays, their keen observational skills, coupled with tactile examination, allowed them to achieve remarkably good results in many cases, though a crooked limb or persistent pain was a common outcome. A quirkier tidbit is that ancient Greek medical texts describe procedures for removing bladder stones, a truly agonizing condition. This involved a lithotomy, cutting into the bladder to extract the stone, a highly dangerous operation with a significant risk of infection and damage to surrounding organs. It speaks volumes about the level of suffering that people were willing to endure such extreme measures. Historians still argue about the true frequency and success rates of complex surgical procedures in ancient Greece. While the texts describe sophisticated techniques, the practical realities of infection, pain, and limited understanding of internal anatomy must have made them incredibly perilous endeavors. You would only consent to such a procedure if your suffering was unbearable, or if death seemed imminent without it. So, as you imagine the cold feel of bronze against your skin, or the searing heat of a cauterizing iron, you are reminded of the stark, often brutal, world of ancient Greek surgery. It was a world where courage was required not just from the patient, but from the physician, who wielded his instruments with a blend of skill, observation, and a desperate hope against overwhelming odds. It reminds you just how precious modern medical advancements truly are, saving lives from ailments that once meant certain, agonizing death. Even if you managed to navigate the perils of disease as an adult, the ancient Greek world presented a gauntlet of horrors during the most vulnerable stage of life, childhood's frail grip. Entering this world was a gamble, and surviving it, a triumph against overwhelming odds. The sweet innocence of youth was constantly shadowed by sickness, making every passing year a small miracle. Imagine a newborn, swaddled tightly, lying in a humble Greek home. The joyous cries of the parents are quickly tempered by the sobering reality of the time. Infant mortality was tragically high. A mainstream historical fact is that estimates suggest up to 30 to 50% of children might not have survived past the age of 5 in ancient Greece. Diseases that we now consider minor nuisances, like measles, whooping cough, or even a severe common cold, could be deadly killers for infants and young children with undeveloped immune systems. You'd see families who had buried multiple children, a grief that was unfortunately far too common. You might joke, darkly, that childhood was less a stage of life and more a prolonged, perilous obstacle course. For the first few days of life, a newborn was considered particularly vulnerable. Exposure to drafts, improper feeding, or even a slight fever could quickly spiral into a fatal illness. Without modern sanitation, clean water, or basic hygiene practices we take for granted, bacterial infections like dysentery were rampant among infants, often leading to rapid dehydration and death. Imagine the desperate parents trying to soothe a child racked with fever and diarrhea, utterly helpless against an invisible enemy. As children grew, they faced a different set of challenges. Malnutrition, while not always fatal on its own, would weaken their bodies, making them more susceptible to other diseases. Parasitic infections were endemic, picked up from contaminated food or water, leading to chronic stomach pain, nutrient deficiencies, and general ill health. Children would often be seen with swollen bellies and thin limbs, telltale signs of a parasitic burden. A quirky tidbit: some ancient Greek texts describe remedies for intestinal worms, using things like pomegranate root or wormwood, indicating how common and recognized this issue was, even if the treatment was often crude. Beyond infections, injuries were also a constant threat. A fall, a burn from an open fire, or an animal bite could all lead to serious complications. Without immediate, sterile medical attention, even a relatively minor injury could become infected, leading to gangrene or tetanus, both almost certainly fatal. You'd see children with permanent deformities from improperly healed fractures, or disfiguring scars from untreated infections. The lack of understanding about childhood-specific diseases meant that treatments were often generalized from adult medicine, or relied heavily on folk remedies and superstitious practices. For a child gripped by convulsions, parents might resort to charms, amulets, or desperate prayers to ward off evil spirits, believing the child was possessed. Historians still argue about the extent to which distinct pediatric practices existed in ancient Greece versus simply applying adult treatments to smaller bodies. The education of children also involved a certain exposure to physical hardship. Spartan children, for example, were famously toughened from a young age, enduring harsh conditions, which, while building resilience, also exposed them to greater risks of illness and injury. Even in Athens, play was often vigorous and unsupervised, leading to cuts, bruises, and broken bones. The constant fragility of childhood had a profound impact on ancient Greek society. It meant that every surviving child was precious, and that the emotional toll of frequent loss was immense. It shaped family structures, funerary practices, and even philosophical outlooks on the nature of life and death. For you, living in this time, witnessing the vulnerability of children would be a constant, heartbreaking reminder of the raw, untamed power of disease, and the daily, quiet heroism of parents simply trying to keep their little ones alive in a world so utterly hostile to fragile life. It makes you deeply appreciate the advancements that allow most children today to reach adulthood with a healthy start. As you observe the rhythms of life in ancient Greece, You can't help but notice that health challenges were not uniformly distributed. The female half of the population faced a unique constellation of ailments and medical beliefs, often intertwined with societal expectations and a limited understanding of their anatomy. This brings us to the specific and often mystifying realm of women's unique ailments. Imagine being a woman in ancient Greece. Your health journey would be fundamentally different from a man's, largely dictated by your reproductive organs and the prevailing, often inaccurate, medical theories about them. A mainstream historical fact is that the ancient Greeks, particularly Hippocratic physicians, believed the uterus or womb was a mobile organ that could wander throughout the body, causing a wide array of symptoms when it became displaced. This fantastical theory, known as the wandering womb, was used to explain conditions ranging from suffocation and hysteria to lethargy and pain in various parts of the body. You might joke that your uterus was just trying to get its steps in, but it was a genuinely terrifying concept for women and their physicians. If you, as a woman, suddenly experienced shortness of breath, a feeling of choking, or even a sudden fainting spell, a physician might immediately suspect your wandering womb. The prescribed remedies were often based on the idea of coaxing the uterus back to its proper place. If it was thought to have wandered upwards towards your head, you might be subjected to foul-smelling fumigations applied to your mouth and nose to repel it downwards, while pleasant-smelling substances were applied to your lower body to attract it. Conversely, if it was thought to have dropped too low, the foul smells might be applied below, and pleasant ones above. Imagine enduring such a treatment, trying not to gag, while hoping your errant organ would finally settle down. Childbirth was, of course, a profoundly dangerous event without modern obstetrics, antiseptic practices, or C-sections. It was a leading cause of death for women. Imagine the terror of labor, prolonged and agonizing, often in a cramped, unhygienic room, attended only by midwives and female relatives. Infections were rampant after delivery, often leading to puerperal fever, a swift and deadly killer. Hemorrhage was also common. Many women would likely endure multiple pregnancies, only to see some, or even all, of their children succumb in infancy, and then face death themselves from complications of childbirth. The societal pressure to produce male heirs only added to the physical and psychological burden. Beyond the wandering womb and childbirth, women also suffered from common ailments related to menstruation. Irregular periods, heavy bleeding, and painful cramps were often treated with a variety of herbal remedies or dietary adjustments, all aimed at rebalancing the humors. Anemia, often caused by poor nutrition and chronic blood loss from menstruation or childbirth, would manifest as persistent fatigue, pallor, and weakness. A quirkier tidbit is that some Hippocratic texts discuss the use of leeches for heavy menstruation, believing that drawing off excess blood would restore humoral balance. The ancient Greek understanding of female anatomy was heavily influenced by male physicians who often did not dissect female bodies. This lack of direct anatomical knowledge, combined with societal taboos, perpetuated many of the misconceptions. Women were often seen as inherently weaker, both physically and emotionally, and more susceptible to certain ailments. Historians still argue about the extent to which ancient Greek medical practices for women were genuinely therapeutic versus serving to reinforce societal norms and control female bodies. So, as you step into the life of a woman in ancient Greece, you carry an additional burden of medical vulnerability. Your body is understood through a lens of humoral imbalances and a mobile uterus, and the most significant events of your life, like childbirth, are fraught with mortal danger. You learn to rely on the wisdom of older women, on traditional herbal remedies, and on the desperate hope that your wandering womb will behave, and that the gods will grant you safe passage through the perils unique to being a woman in this ancient world. As you experience the pervasive, individual threats of disease in ancient Greece, there is one historical event that stands as a terrifying testament to the destructive power of illness on a societal scale: the Plague of Athens. This was not merely a cluster of individual cases. It was a devastating epidemic that crippled a mighty city and altered the course of history. Imagine yourself in Athens, In the year 430 BCE, the Peloponnesian War is raging, and your city, usually vibrant and bustling, is now besieged by Spartan forces. People from the surrounding countryside have flooded into the crowded city walls seeking refuge, dramatically increasing the population density. The air is thick with the dust of thousands of feet, the chatter of anxious voices, and the ominous quiet of a city under siege. Then, it begins. It starts subtly at first. A few isolated cases reported near the port of Piraeus. A fever, a cough, a sudden, horrifying onset of symptoms. Then, it spreads, with terrifying speed, tearing through the densely packed tenements and public spaces. A mainstream historical fact is that the Plague of Athens, meticulously documented by the historian Thucydides, who himself contracted and survived it, devastated the city's population during the Peloponnesian War, killing an estimated 1/4 to 1/3 of Athens' citizens. Imagine the horror of seeing a sickness spread with such ferocity, seemingly unstoppable. Thucydides' chilling description paints a vivid picture of the symptoms: sudden violent heats in the head, redness and inflammation of the eyes, a foul-smelling breath, violent sneezes, a hoarseness of the voice, followed by a cough and violent pains in the chest. Then, severe stomach pains, vomiting of bile, and a terrifying, unquenchable thirst. The skin would turn reddish, then break out in small pustules and ulcers. Many sufferers couldn't bear to wear clothes and would throw themselves into cold water, seeking relief from the burning internal heat. The bodies of the dead would sometimes be found piled up, as there weren't enough healthy people to bury them. You might joke, with a shiver, that it was the ancient world's worst ever case of cabin fever combined with a biological weapon. The sheer speed and indiscriminate nature of the plague were particularly terrifying. It struck down the healthy and the weak, the rich and the poor, the young and the old, without apparent discrimination. Physicians were helpless. Their humoral theories and herbal remedies proved utterly useless against this unknown, virulent killer. Many doctors themselves succumbed, along with their patients. The social fabric of Athens began to unravel. Fear and despair gripped the population. People stopped caring for the sick, abandoning even family members. As the risk of contagion was too high, lawlessness became rampant, as people reasoned that if they were to die anyway, there was no point in upholding societal norms. A quirkier tidbit about the plague is that animals, particularly birds, were also affected, dying after consuming the bodies of the infected. This observation further underscored the mysterious and pervasive nature of the disease, suggesting it was an affliction not just on humanity, but on the natural world itself. Historians still argue vehemently about the true identity of the pathogen that caused the Plague of Athens. Theories have ranged from typhus, smallpox, and measles, to anthrax, and even a form of Ebola or an entirely unknown viral hemorrhagic fever. The debate continues, with modern scientific analysis of ancient remains still trying to pinpoint the exact culprit. What is clear, however, is that it was an unprecedented catastrophe. The plague had profound consequences. It severely weakened Athens, draining its manpower and morale, and undoubtedly contributed to its eventual defeat in the Peloponnesian War. It left a lasting psychological scar on the survivors, shaping their worldview and their understanding of humanity's vulnerability. You would live with the memory of those horrifying months, the sight of bodies piled high, the smell of death hanging heavy in the air. It was a stark, undeniable reminder that no amount of philosophical genius or military might could stand against the silent, invisible onslaught of a truly horrifying disease. And as you feel the phantom chills of that ancient terror, you understand that some horrors are timeless, forever lurking in the shadows of human existence, even if you somehow manage to escape the devastating sweep of a widespread plague. Life in ancient Greece presented numerous other ways for your body to be compromised, beyond the unseen enemies of disease. There were very tangible dangers, especially in the form of wounds of war and sport. For men, in particular, these physical traumas were a common, brutal reality, often leaving lasting marks or leading to a premature end. Imagine yourself as a citizen soldier, a hoplite, marching into battle. The heavy bronze hoplite shield, the aspis, offers significant protection, but it isn't invulnerable. A spear thrust, a sword slash, or a javelin impact could easily find its mark. A mainstream historical fact is that hoplite warfare, characterized by tightly packed phalanxes, involved intense, close-quarters combat where injuries to the limbs and face were common. You might take a glancing blow to the head that splits your scalp open, or a spear might graze your leg, leaving a painful, bleeding wound. Even if not immediately fatal, these injuries could be debilitating. Without modern antibiotics, any open wound was an invitation to infection. A simple cut could fester, turning into a painful abscess or worse, lead to gangrene, where the flesh rots and turns black, if you were lucky. A surgeon might amputate the limb. But as we discussed, that was a truly terrifying procedure with low survival rates. More often, the infection would spread through your bloodstream, leading to a slow, agonizing death from sepsis. You'd see veterans with missing fingers, limping gaits, or deep, disfiguring scars, grim badges of honor from their time on the battlefield. You might joke, rather grimly, that a true veteran was defined not by his medals, but by the number of limbs he still possessed. Beyond the battlefield, the ancient Greeks were passionate about sport, particularly athletic competitions like the Olympic Games. While celebrated for their glory, these events were also incredibly dangerous. Imagine yourself competing in wrestling or boxing, bare-knuckle contests that left combatants battered and bruised. Broken noses, shattered teeth, dislocated joints, and even severe head trauma were common occurrences. These weren't contests for the faint of heart. They were brutal tests of endurance and strength, often with severe physical consequences. A quirky tidbit is that boxers in ancient Greece would wrap their hands with strips of leather, sometimes weighted with lead, to make their punches more devastating, almost guaranteeing injury to both participants. Even in less extreme sports, injuries were frequent. Running on uneven ground could lead to sprained ankles or twisted knees. Discus and javelin throwing could result in strains, pulled muscles, or accidental impalement if an errant throw went awry. While the gymnasium promoted physical health, it also presented ample opportunities for injury. The treatment of these traumatic injuries would fall under the purview of physicians, who, armed with their knowledge of anatomy often gleaned from studying animals or unfortunate gladiators and their instruments, would attempt to repair the damage. They were skilled at setting broken bones, cleaning wounds, and using bandages and poultices. However, without knowledge of internal bleeding or sterile techniques, many seemingly minor injuries could still prove fatal. Historians still argue about the effectiveness of ancient Greek surgical practices for severe traumatic injuries, while their anatomical understanding was impressive for the time. Their inability to prevent infection remained a critical hurdle. You would likely witness the aftermath of such injuries firsthand. A friend might return from battle with a grievous wound, or a local athlete might be carried home from the games, his body broken. The sight of these traumas, and the subsequent struggles for recovery, would be a constant reminder of the fragility of the human body. Even in a society that celebrated physical prowess, it highlights the brutal reality that in a world without modern safety nets, every moment of physical exertion, whether in war or sport, carried with it the very real risk of permanent disfigurement, chronic pain, or an early, agonizing death. Beyond the visible wounds and the physical torments of disease, the ancient Greek world also grappled with the more elusive and often misunderstood realm of mental anguish. Ancient views. While their understanding of the brain and psychology was rudimentary, they certainly recognized behaviors we would now label as mental illness, though their explanations and treatments varied wildly from our own. Imagine a citizen, perhaps a respected philosopher or a brave soldier, who suddenly begins to exhibit erratic behavior. He might hear voices, speak incoherently, suffer from bouts of extreme melancholy, or fly into uncontrollable rages. For the average Greek, the immediate interpretation of such symptoms often lean towards the supernatural. A mainstream historical fact is that madness, or mania, was frequently attributed to divine intervention, a punishment or possession by angry gods or malevolent spirits. You might joke that if you suddenly started arguing with invisible people, your neighbors would be less concerned about your mental health and more about which deity you defended. Apollo, the Furies goddesses of vengeance, or even Dionysus, the god of ecstasy and madness, were often cited as the culprits. This meant that the first recourse for someone suffering from severe mental distress might be religious rituals, purification ceremonies, or appeals to oracles for divine guidance. The individual might be taken to a temple, not for a medical cure, but for an exorcism or to seek a prophetic dream that would reveal the divine cause of their affliction. However, as Hippocratic thought gained traction, a more naturalistic approach began to emerge, even for mental disorders. The humoral theory, which you remember from earlier, was extended to explain mental states. For instance, melancholy, a state akin to modern depression, was believed to be caused by an excess of black bile. If you suffered from persistent sadness, lethargy, and a loss of interest in life, a physician might diagnose you with an imbalance of this humor. The prescribed treatments would then focus on rebalancing it, perhaps through dietary changes, herbal remedies that were believed to purge black bile, or even bloodletting. Conversely, conditions involving extreme excitement or mania might be attributed to an excess of yellow bile or blood. The treatment would then aim to cool or calm the body, perhaps through cold baths, gentle exercise, or soothing herbal teas, while their understanding of neurochemistry was non-existent. The idea that diet and environment could influence mood was a remarkably astute, if indirectly arrived at, observation. A quirky tidbit: ancient Greeks sometimes used music therapy for mental ailments. Certain melodies or rhythms were believed to have specific effects on the humors and the soul, capable of soothing agitation or lifting melancholy. So, if you were feeling particularly down, a trip to a skilled musician might be prescribed, a sort of ancient playlist for your soul. For those with severe, uncontrollable conditions, confinement was sometimes necessary, often within the family home. There were no dedicated asylums as we understand them. The family bore the primary responsibility for care, which could be an immense burden. Discrimination and stigma were certainly present, but some accounts also suggest a degree of compassion, particularly if the affliction was seen as divinely inspired. Historians still argue about the extent to which ancient Greek society integrated or ostracized individuals with severe mental illness, as evidence is often fragmented and open to interpretation. So, as you witness the struggles with mental anguish in ancient Greece, you recognize a fascinating blend of mystical explanation and nascent scientific inquiry. The madman might be feared as divinely touched or pitied as suffering from a humoral imbalance. There were no psychiatrists or therapists, but there were priests, philosophers, and physicians, each offering their own pathways to understanding and alleviating the invisible pains of the mind. It's a testament to the enduring human quest to make sense of, and cope with, the bewildering complexities of the human psyche, even when the answers remained stubbornly out of reach. While the individual struggles with disease and injury were constant in ancient Greece, communities also made surprisingly concerted, if often insufficient, efforts to manage public health. This brings us to the fascinating, sometimes contradictory, realm of hygiene and public health in a world without modern germ theory. Imagine walking through a bustling ancient Greek city. Your senses are immediately assaulted the smell of human waste, rotting refuse, and stale cooking fires. Sanitation, by modern standards, was rudimentary at best. Open sewers were common in many areas, and waste disposal was often haphazard. This lack of proper waste management was a primary breeding ground for disease. You might joke that the fresh air often carried with it a delightful bouquet of urban decay. However, the Greeks were not entirely oblivious to the concept of cleanliness. A mainstream historical fact is that many Greek cities, particularly larger ones like Athens and Olympia, constructed impressive public works for water supply, including aqueducts and elaborate fountain houses. They understood that fresh, clean water was vital for health. You'd see citizens regularly drawing water from these fountains. A small act of daily hygiene that made a significant difference. Bathing was also a common practice, both in private homes and in public bathhouses or gymnasia. These baths weren't just for cleanliness. They were social hubs, places for exercise, discussion, and relaxation. Imagine the simple pleasure of immersing yourself in warm water after a long day, scrubbing away the grime. Even if the water itself might not have been perfectly sterile, despite their efforts. The understanding of disease transmission was severely limited. They connected foul smells miasma to illness, believing that bad air caused sickness. This miasma theory, while incorrect about the actual cause, did encourage some beneficial practices, like ventilation and the removal of obvious sources of stench, such as rotting carcasses, if a particularly foul smell was reported. Efforts might be made to clear it. A practical response based on a flawed premise. Public spaces, especially large gathering places like the agora marketplaces or theaters, presented challenges. The sheer number of people in close proximity facilitated the rapid spread of airborne diseases. Imagine the coughing and sneezing in a crowded theater, completely unaware of the tiny, invisible particles being exhaled. Historians still argue about the effectiveness of ancient Greek quarantine measures during epidemics. While some cities would isolate the sick or restrict travel, these efforts were often too late or inconsistently applied. For the sick, conditions within homes or temporary care facilities were often crowded and unsanitary. Bedding might not be regularly changed, and sick individuals would be in close contact with their caregivers, leading to further spread of disease within families. A quirkier tidbit is that some Greek cities, particularly those with a strong military focus like Sparta, might have had stricter regulations regarding public cleanliness and even individual hygiene for their soldiers. Recognizing the impact of health on military effectiveness, the medical treatises of the Hippocratic school also emphasized individual hygiene. Physicians would advise patients on the importance of regular bathing, cleaning wounds, and maintaining a healthy living environment, within the limitations of the technology and understanding of the time. While they lacked microscopes and germ theory, their observational skills often led them to intuitively grasp some correlations between cleanliness and health. Ultimately, public health in ancient Greece was a patchwork of rudimentary understanding, impressive engineering feats for water supply, and pervasive, unseen threats. You lived in a world where the biggest dangers were often invisible, where even the cleanest fountain could harbor unseen enemies, and where the smell of decay was a constant, grim reminder of the fragility of life. It's a testament to human resilience that, despite these challenges, their civilization not only survived but flourished, paving the way for future advancements in medicine and sanitation that would one day allow us to conquer many of the horrors they faced daily. Having navigated the challenges of hygiene and the broad theories of disease, your journey through ancient Greek health now turns to the practical tools used in everyday healing herbal remedies. Ancient pharmacy. Before sophisticated synthetic drugs, the natural world was the primary source of medicine, and Greek physicians and lay healers alike possessed an astonishing, if empirical, knowledge of plants and their properties. Imagine yourself suffering from a persistent cough or stomach upset. Your first recourse, or that of your family, would likely be to consult a local wise woman, an herbalist, or a physician trained in the Hippocratic tradition. They wouldn't pull out a prescription pad, but rather a collection of dried leaves, roots, and flowers, each believed to hold specific healing powers. You might joke that the ancient Greek pharmacy was less a sterile lab and more a well-stocked garden shed. A mainstream historical fact is that ancient Greek physicians extensively documented the medicinal uses of plants. The Hippocratic corpus, for example, contains descriptions of hundreds of plants and their applications for various ailments, from fevers and inflammation to digestive issues and wounds. These were not just random concoctions. There was a systematic attempt to categorize and understand their effects based on observation and experience, often linked back to the humoral theory. A hot herb might be used to counteract an excess of cold phlegm, for example. you would encounter a wide array of these botanical cures. For pain relief, poppy opium was well known and widely used, though its addictive properties were also understood. Imagine the blessed relief a dose of opium might bring to a patient suffering from chronic pain or the agony of surgery, even if it came with its own risks. For digestive issues, herbs like mint, fennel, or dill were commonly prescribed to soothe upset stomachs or aid digestion. If you had a fever, willow bark, containing salicin, a precursor to aspirin, might be chewed or steeped in a tea to reduce inflammation and pain, a surprisingly effective ancient analgesic. For external wounds, astringent herbs like myrtle or oak bark might be used to stop bleeding, while poultices made from mallow or fig leaves could be applied to reduce swelling and draw out pus. Imagine the familiar earthy smell of these herbal concoctions as they were prepared, a blend of hope and practicality. A quirky tidbit is that some ancient Greek physicians even recommended specific types of lettuce for their sedative properties, believing it could help with insomnia. So, a hearty salad might have been your ancient sleeping pill. The preparation of these remedies was an art in itself. Herbs might be dried, ground into powders, infused in wine or water, steeped as teas, or mixed with oil to create salves and ointments. The dosage and combination of herbs were often based on accumulated wisdom passed down through generations, a blend of tradition and empirical observation. Historians still argue about the true efficacy of many of these ancient herbal remedies. While some undoubtedly possess genuine medicinal properties, others likely offered little more than a placebo effect, or, in some cases, were even harmful if not prepared correctly. However, the importance of this botanical knowledge cannot be overstated. In a world without synthetic drugs, these plants were the front-line defense against illness and suffering. The careful observation of plants, their growth cycles, and their effects on the human body laid crucial groundwork for later advancements in botany and pharmacology. You would learn, often through trial and error, which plants offered relief and which were best avoided. And as you chewed on a bitter root or inhaled the steam from a herbal infusion, you would be participating in a healing tradition that stretched back to the very dawn of human civilization, a testament to humanity's enduring quest to find solace and cures in the natural world. As you delve deeper into the ancient Greek world of health and disease, you come to appreciate that the pursuit of understanding wasn't confined to practical healers alone. The intellectual ferment of the era, where logic and reason were prized, led to a fascinating interplay between abstract thought and practical medical knowledge. This brings us to the evolving relationship between philosophers and physicians. Imagine yourself in the bustling intellectual hub of Athens, perhaps near the Academy or the Lyceum. You hear discussions not just about politics and ethics, but about the very nature of the human body, the causes of illness, and the path to health. While Hippocrates and his followers were honing their empirical observations at the patient's bedside, towering philosophical figures were also pondering the same questions, often from a more theoretical perspective. You might joke that the philosophers were trying to cure you with pure thought, which, while commendable, rarely stopped a fever. A mainstream historical fact is that many prominent Greek philosophers, including Aristotle, engaged deeply with medical and biological subjects, sometimes acting as physician philosophers themselves. Aristotle, for instance, conducted extensive studies on anatomy and physiology. Albeit primarily through animal dissection, his meticulous observations, though not always accurate by modern standards, contributed significantly to the body of biological knowledge. Even if his humoral theories were ultimately flawed, he sought to understand the body as an integrated system, where parts functioned for a purpose, moving beyond purely mystical explanations. This intellectual cross-pollination was not always harmonious. Physicians, particularly those of the Hippocratic school, emphasized empirical observation and the collection of clinical data. They were suspicious of grand, abstract theories that weren't grounded in direct experience. They valued prognosis, the ability to predict the course of a disease, which required careful, ongoing observation of the patient. Philosophers, on the other hand, might approach health from a more deductive angle, seeking universal principles that governed the body and its ailments. This tension between theoretical speculation and practical application was a fertile ground for debate and intellectual growth. Consider the concept of the physis, or nature, for philosophers. Understanding the physis of a human being, its essential characteristics and functions, was key to understanding health and disease. For physicians, observing the physis of a disease, its natural progression and typical symptoms, was crucial for diagnosis and treatment. Both sought to uncover underlying natural laws, moving away from divine intervention. But they approached it from different angles. Historians still argue whether the theoretical contributions of philosophers truly advanced medical practice, or sometimes led to overly speculative, unproven theories. A quirky tidbit is that some philosophical schools, like the Pythagoreans, integrated health and diet into their ethical and spiritual beliefs. They advocated vegetarianism and strict regimens for purity, believing that certain foods could corrupt the body and the soul. This showed how deeply interconnected concepts of well-being were, spanning physical, mental, and even spiritual dimensions. So, your ancient Greek health plan might come with a side of ethical philosophy. The legacy of this interplay is profound. The Greek tradition of rational inquiry, of seeking natural explanations for phenomena, was fundamentally applied to the human body and its illnesses, even when their conclusions were wrong, like the wandering womb or the precise balance of humors. The method of questioning, observing, and theorizing laid the intellectual groundwork for future scientific revolutions. You are, in a sense, a beneficiary of this ancient intellectual struggle, where minds dared to dissect, to classify, and to understand the complex machinery of life. As you reflect on the Greek approach, you see that the pursuit of health was not just a matter for the sick or their healers, but a central theme in the intellectual life of the polis. The dialogues between philosophers and physicians, sometimes collaborative, sometimes contentious, slowly chipped away at the wall of ignorance surrounding disease, moving towards a world where ailments could be understood, if not always cured, through the power of human reason and careful observation. It reminds you that even the most horrifying diseases can spur profound advancements in human thought. As our journey through the horrifying diseases of ancient Greece draws to a close, it's time to consider the enduring impact, the disease's lasting legacy, on both ancient Greek society and, remarkably, on our own world. These ancient struggles with illness weren't just isolated events. They shaped demographics, influenced culture, and laid foundational stones for the medical science we know today. Imagine looking back at the bustling city of Athens, or a remote farming village. The omnipresent threat of disease had a profound effect on daily life. It shaped family size, as high infant mortality often meant parents had more children than they expected to survive. It influenced social structures, as the sick and the healthy interacted within communities that often lacked effective isolation methods. It drove architectural choices, with a preference for open-air spaces and access to fresh water. Even if the underlying miasma theory was flawed, you might joke, with a sigh of relief, that at least ancient Greek parties didn't involve germ-laden potlucks. The philosophical and religious responses to disease also left an indelible mark. The concept of divine punishment for illness, while largely superseded by scientific thought, continued to influence beliefs for centuries. The desperate pilgrimages to Asclepiaia highlight humanity's enduring need for hope and solace in the face of suffering, a need that persists even in an age of advanced medicine. Historians still argue whether the widespread belief in divine intervention hindered or, perhaps, inadvertently aided early medical observation by providing a framework, however flawed, for understanding and responding to sickness. Perhaps the most significant legacy, however, stems from the Hippocratic Revolution. The shift from supernatural explanations to natural causes, the emphasis on observation, prognosis, and the ethical conduct of physicians, these were monumental steps. A mainstream historical fact is that the Hippocratic Oath, or at least the principles it embodies, continues to be a foundational ethical guide for medical professionals worldwide. emphasizing do no harm and patient confidentiality. This ancient Greek commitment to rational inquiry laid the very groundwork for the scientific method in medicine. You are, in essence, benefiting from their pioneering efforts every time a doctor examines your symptoms systematically. The practical medical knowledge accumulated during this period, even with its limitations, also provided a base. Their extensive pharmacopoeia of herbal remedies, their techniques for setting bones, and their surgical instruments, rudimentary as they were passed down, refined, and built upon by later civilizations, particularly the Romans and then Islamic scholars. Much of what we know about ancient diseases comes directly from their meticulous descriptions, particularly those of Thucydides during the Plague of Athens, providing invaluable historical and epidemiological data. A quirky tidbit is that some of the herbal remedies described in ancient Greek texts are still in use in traditional medicine practices today, a testament to their long-observed efficacy. The very language of medicine is infused with Greek roots: diagnosis, prognosis, therapy, symptom, epidemic. These are all Greek words. This linguistic inheritance reflects the foundational influence of ancient Greek medical thought on Western civilization. When you use these terms, you are speaking a language shaped by the very physicians who wrestled with humoral imbalances and wandering wombs. Ultimately, the horrifying diseases of ancient Greece were not just scourges to be endured. They were catalysts for intellectual and social evolution. They forced humanity to question, to observe, to innovate, and to develop systems for caring for the sick. They reveal a resilient human spirit, constantly seeking understanding and relief in a world where vulnerability was a daily companion. And as you reflect on this long, arduous journey through ancient ailments, you come to appreciate the profound courage of those who lived through such challenging times, and the enduring legacy of their struggles, which continues to inform and inspire our own quest for health and well-being. The sounds of the ancient world are finally fading now, becoming impossibly distant. The phantom coughs, the desperate prayers, the whispered diagnoses, they are all settling into the quiet depths of the past. Your mind is no longer wandering through crowded marketplaces or hushed temple dormitories. The weight of those old fears, the mystery of those ancient ailments, is gently lifting. You are here, now, safe in your own space. Feel the softness beneath you, the cool air on your skin. There's nothing left to worry about, nothing to analyze, just the quiet calm of your room, drawing you deeper into peaceful rest. Let the stories melt away, leaving only the soft hum of the fan or the distant murmur of the night. Sleep now, deeply and serenely, and end of script, sweet dreams.